Good evening. My name is Nancy Dallavalli, and I am the director of the Center for Catholic Studies at Fairfield University. Tonight, we are continuing a new partnership between the Center and Commonweal magazine, an innovative 3-event series called Commonweal in Conversation. This virtual seminar has as its theme many questions, issues, voices, and symbols that come to the fore when we talk about Catholicism and gender. We all know this is a big issue. It's a deal breaker for many of the younger persons in the pews, and it is raising questions for many contemporary Catholics. This series is offered as part of an academic course on Catholicism and gender at Fairfield University. Hello, RS2336. And I look forward to making this an annual spring event, always focusing on Catholicism and gender. I do have a housekeeping note. There's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen or perhaps at the top. Feel free to touch that at any point and see then where you can enter your own question. And we will offer these to Professor Ford as we get to the question and answer portion of our program. One other note is that we're in Connecticut out here and we are having high wild winds. And so we may have some popping on and off. And so if there's any problem, we will just do our best and pick it up. And I think we have a backup plan tonight. Tonight, we are welcoming Craig A. Ford, Assistant Professor of Theology and Religious Studies at St. Norbert College, where he teaches courses in Christian ethics, race, gender, and sexuality and ecclesiology, while also serving as the director of the Institute for Peace and Justice Studies, as well as working with the Institute for Black Catholics. He's a graduate of Notre Dame University, and he does a lot of work with the intersection of sexuality, gender, and race. We are grateful for his presence here tonight. He does not have a big wind out where he is, but I think he's in snowy Wisconsin. And so we are happy to welcome Professor Ford tonight. Thank you so much for being with us.
Yes, thank you, Professor Dallavalli, and good evening to everyone who is on this call tonight. I was told that we need to have a conversation, and this is like my favorite type of theology discussion to have. So my hope is that as I don't have a slide deck for us, not just because I want you to stare at my face for 20 minutes, but because my hope is that we can get to a point where, I'm actually interacting with the questions and the concerns that you are bringing to this talk, which you might have seen advertised as Queer Bodies, Queer God, and that's the title that I'm working with now. To frame my comments, I want this discussion to be framed by 3 different images, but all coming from the Bible that many of us who have experience within the Christian tradition or identify as Christians or have been studying it for a while, we are familiar with how important and central this text is to how we make sense of how God is calling us. And the 3 biblical images, is one comes from Genesis, is creation. Another one comes from the book of Matthew, one of the Gospels, and that's discipleship or calling. And then the third one comes from the book of Job, which invites us to think about the vastness, the incomprehensibility of God. So those 3 images are the ones that I'm going to continue to work with and think around with us tonight. And my hope is that these images will ignite a conversation about the relationship between queerness, and we'll talk a bit more about what that might mean, and our ideas about God and ourselves. So those 3 biblical images, one from creation coming from Genesis, another one coming from Matthew, talking about discipleship, and a third talking about God's incomprehensibility and God's vastness that comes from the book of Job. Throughout this conversation that I want to start, my goal is to reapproach how we think about God's own being on the one hand and our own, thus queer God, queer bodies, thinking about these 2 things that we talk about often, bodies and God, but I want to ask if we can reapproach it in a new way. And my hope is that this reappraisal gives us a window or an aperture into appreciating how the diversity we find in our own embodiment as human beings, particularly that diversity that we might remark as queer or unusual, is actually a reflection of God's own being. And you might think in a conversation about queer theology and just queer theology in general, that you're going to get a lot of new stuff. And there is a lot of new stuff in the field. But one of the things I think gets overlooked is how these observations that many of us make in the field of queer theology actually bring back some ancient observations that Christians have made throughout the tradition. And I want to highlight three of those, and I'll call them out now with the hope that as I talk, they might become even more apparent what they mean. The first ancient observation that comes from the Catholic tradition when we talk about how God's own being reflects how God's being can be seen helpfully in the way that we talk or encounter queer bodies and queer people. The first thing that we learn from that interaction is that God is fundamentally mysterious and God is fundamentally incomprehensible. I think that's the first observation that we're going to grasp. And that is not a new observation within the Christian tradition. That's actually one of the oldest observations within the Christian tradition. Second, right, that this mysterious God calls us to a life of transformation. And the term that we use, the one I used before, we hear all the time, discipleship, right? Discipleship is a synonym for transformation. It means that we follow God where God is leading us. And I believe that if we think about our own lives as these projects that God is transforming, especially for those of us in the Catholic tradition, through our life engaging with the sacraments, engaging with prayer, engaging in service, we emerge as transformed as we grow as Christians. I think a helpful reframe of this is to see how the journey that trans and gender non-binary people make to their own true selves is also a reflection of transition, also a reflection of discipleship, ultimately a response to calling. And the third thing, that is in some way an ancient observation, right? That God calls us to discipleship. So that's the ancient one. I kind of appended what I was talking about that I'll argue at least later. But the third ancient observation that I want us to be aware of is that we should be wary of placing God into neat conceptual theological boxes, which I know is a deep occupational hazard for people who identify as theologians. So I just want to note how difficult that can potentially be, right? On the one hand, we want to understand God as this deep, fundamental mystery and vast and fundamentally mysterious. But yet, what I do every day is try to make that make sense to people, right? One of the ancient observations in the church is that trying to undertake a process of making God easily comprehensible, conceptual, that is actually the doorway to idolatry, to coming up with a God that is less vast, that is less real than the actual God that exists, right? So in this talk, I want to kind of return to these three ancient observations to put us right in front of what we might think of as the incredibly unfamiliar, which is how do we bring Catholicism into this productive conversation with the experiences that trans and gender non-binary people are telling us, and to do so in a way that sees a convergence between their own observations and what we have inherited throughout the Christian tradition. And this might also lead towards a way of reframing and making the Christian tradition more accommodating to the insights that trans and gender non-binary people are bringing to our lives. So let's start with this first biblical image, the one that comes from creation. And I promise you, I'm not going to read for too long, but there is a short reading. I want to quote Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 and 27, and it reads as follows. Then God said, let us make humans in our own image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. So God created humans in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. And that's the end of the reading. Often when we think about gender and sexuality and also sexual identity, this verse gets raised, right? It often gets raised if you're looking at official documents that are coming out from various dioceses. It gets raised as a flag to say, our being made in the image of God includes this reality, our being created as male and as female. And this often gets lifted up as an argument against the legitimacy of many of the practices that trans and gender non-binary people undertake in order to bring more into being their own gender identity that they understand themselves to have. that this is erected as a wall or as a barrier against the legitimacy of their identities. So if you've seen it in that way, I want us to take a step back from that for a second. I want us to ask a question of the text. I find the Bible to be most helpful when I open it up and I read something and I just say, well, what does this really mean? What does it mean to like encounter this text in the ways that many people have encountered this text over time, but also how scholars look at this text from a contemporary period, from our contemporary moment, right? So the question that gets raised in my mind is, what does it really mean to be made in the image of God? This question, once again, not a new question, one of the oldest questions that Christians have asked, right? And the classic answer that we receive throughout the Christian tradition is that human beings are animals, but we are animals of a particular type. We are animals who reason, right? And one way that I try to break down and get to the core of what reasoning might be, what makes us, so to speak, rational animals, is that we are the sort of animals that ask the question, why? In the world of the text, what distinguishes human beings from non-human beings in this planet is that we are the only beings we know that organize our lives often around the question of why. And I think this is really, you can have a humorous observation about this, right? I just spent the weekend with a 5-year-old, and that is the only question I was asked the entire weekend. 5 said, why do we do this? Why that? Why this? It's so natural to us to ask the purpose or the reason behind something. And that's what distinguishes us according to the Christian tradition. We are the rational animal. So I'm thinking about this, okay, so Christianity has taught us, the Christian tradition has offered to us, right, that what makes us in the image of God is that we, like God, can reason. We, like God, can ask questions. We, like God, can try to figure out the origin, the root of things. Now, human beings, being animals also, we reproduce. That is obvious in the ancient world as it is obvious today. And the authors of Genesis, noting this, said, hey, human beings, like all the other animals that God created, also reproduce. And what allows for reproduction to occur? Imagine yourself in the ancient world, or even imagine yourself just bombarded with the images we get around what a family is. You would think, oh, well, a male and a female are required for that. And this makes a lot of sense of why the authors of the text would highlight male and female as the ways that human beings come to image God. Because in the very next verse, which I didn't read, but we'll read to you now, God gives the command, be fruitful and multiply. So the energy of the text is drawing us to, I think, two observations. One is that human beings are like the rest of creation, right? In the sense that we, like the rest of the world, reproduce, right? But also human beings are unlike the rest of creation. And that's why in this account of creation, while God says that everything is good, when God looks at humankind, God says human beings are very good. And part of it is because we are made in this image and likeness of God. And so if you're reading it like me, you're reading this verse descriptively, right? It's a creation story. You can imagine being a little kid around a fire and someone, a storyteller, is standing up and saying, hey, this is what happened. Well, on the first day, God created all of these things. And the next day, God created all of these things, right? And you can read it descriptively, right? It describes what creation looks like. But as the Catholic tradition has evolved, especially as we look at official Catholic teaching, remember that observation I mentioned way back about how this verse gets read as a barrier to legitimizing the journeys that trans and gender non-binary people make. Instead of Genesis being read descriptively to describe creation, it gets read in a proscriptive sense, as a way of trying to diagnose what is acceptable versus what is undesirable or unacceptable, right? And so when you read Genesis 1:26 through 28 and say, God created human beings in only these two ways, and that is all the only way in which human beings come, then if you find human beings existing in other ways, you might be inclined to then say in a proscriptive reading that those other ways are illegitimate or wrong. This is one of the conclusions that come from this one conclusion that comes from observations based on one of the most famous texts that are used by Catholics today, the Theology of the Body by John Paul II. Pope John Paul II, maintained that when God looks at creation and God creates the human being or human beings, these two fundamental types stand at the root, unalterable, male, female, unalterable. And the reason why is because this connection that human beings have to reproduction, right? And the connection that, and this connection also gets somewhat spiritualized as well, where John Paul II will highlight how there is, in a certain way, this complementarity between the genders that gets illustrated in a number of different ways, not only physically in terms of sexual reproduction, but also psychologically. So sometimes when people talk about describe gender like male behavior or masculine behavior and feminine behavior, and they say, oh, they're different, but they are complementary. These are all meant to be like indirect evidence for this complementary that God built from the very beginning of creation, right? Well, one of the things we also learn from as human beings, once again, we're the types of beings that ask why. This is the basic scientific question of our existence. As we've continued to ask why, and also how, and also what, and all these other great questions that we ask as human beings, we have learned that male and female, as the only two options for making sense of how human beings come at a root level of their embodiment, is not sufficient. That's something that we've learned. And what's really interesting, that when I started to read about this, it really blew my mind, is that it's not even the case for just human beings, but for also non-human beings as well. So 2 examples, right? Let's start with non-humans. If you've ever seen these very cute clownfish, one of the things you may not know is that they don't exist as male or female. Every clownfish starts its life as a male, and then towards the end of its life, as it gets older, becomes female. One of the ways that biologists have been able to study nature is to say this model, this binary model, doesn't always fit the complexity of the created world. Now let's turn to human beings, right? Human beings, while the classification scheme that we use to talk about our bodies allow for the vast majority to be captured by male or female because of how we've designed it, that doesn't cover everyone. We know that there are people for whom those two categories just don't fit. These are people either living with, they go by the name is somewhat, depends on the context, but these are people living with DSD, so-called disorders of sexual development, or more commonly, people who are intersex people. That we know as a fact that there are people who are neither male or female, but exist in this middle space between the two. And so I wonder if our knowledge, if our investigation of the created world that God put and set into being leads us to see that there's an inadequacy in our categories, what does that do for us when we return to Genesis, right? If we read it proscriptively, then we already have our answer. These other things become illegitimate. These other observations somehow have to be wiped away as, statistically insignificant, or in some way trying to dismiss this. But if we read it the way I think the authors of Genesis may have wanted us to read it, as descriptive, what we are doing is deepening what is going on in Genesis. That, yes, God creates male and female, but there's nothing in that verse that says that that's it. And in fact, one of the gifts that God gives us, the gift of why, of asking these questions, provides an explanation for why we amend our understandings of creation when we come to new understandings of it, because we can't help it. God designed us to be the types of creatures who are irritating, like our 5-year-olds who only say why all the time and want a better answer. We are the types of beings that want to understand the density and the breadth and the complexity around us. And so maybe, and this is, I think, really likely, what our ancestors in the 6th century BCE thought may not hold in the 21st century CE. And that holds for so many things. Might it also hold for how we think about gender, right? And I imagine if we read this as descriptively, we are going to then continue to say, well, what more is there to our existence? And that, I think, brings us back to God, right? If we ask what more is there, at some point we're going to point our head to the sky, and not only when there's a solar eclipse on Monday, but just look maybe in the night when you're just looking at the stars. You're going to ask yourself, what is behind all this? And as you kind of drift into the galaxy, you're going to say, behind all this is a mystery. And that is fitting because here's that ancient observation returning. God in God's own nature is a mystery. And why is God a mystery? The early Christians knew the answer. Because God, in order to create all that exists, in some way has to be beyond all of what exists. And if all of us exist in this way, as creatures who have a task, who have an inclination, a proclivity to asking why, or whatever our desires to, whatever our natural orientation is as creatures, whatever we think about doing. God sits on the other side of that. God sits as the origin, and that makes God fundamentally unlike us, right? God is the one entity, if you want to use that word, that needs to exist. The rest of us exist as a gift. That makes God fundamentally that makes God fundamentally unlike us. So that's the first ancient observation that we return to. The second one I want to highlight is Matthew. This is a quicker verse. So Matthew 9:9 maintains that as Jesus was walking along, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at a tax collection station, and he said to him, "Follow me." And he got up and followed him. That's it. What I love about this is how I would never do what Matthew did. I have a job. I have things to do. I never wonder, can I just get up and leave? I mean, I want to leave sometimes, but I never like just leave. This guy, Jesus shows up out of nowhere. It's not like Matthew was expecting. And Jesus says, get up and go. And this guy just goes. It is one of the funniest stories to me. I remember when I was a little kid and I remember saying like, Mom, he just left his job. And like, yeah, you know. But I think one of the things that makes that story so interesting is that it's a paradigm for our own lives, right? If God comes to us and says, follow me, are we willing to go and follow? As scary as that is, right? As scary as it would be if someone walked into my office right now and said, come and follow me. If I did that, if I actually did that, I would be risking so much. If I have other responsibilities, I'm not taking care of them and I'm just leaving. But that's what we're called to do in our love of God, to leave the world behind to learn more about how God wants the world to be and try to bring that world into existence. And we have to learn what that is, and that's what discipleship is essentially about. But I love Matthew because it highlights the affect, like, or at least for me, it highlights the affect of how scary that is. In the Catholic tradition, we talk about this all the time as pursuing the virtuous life. When we fall in love with God, what God wants to do is deepen that love through the virtues, through being more just people, through being more temperate people, which for me means being able to avoid saying yes to Netflix in the 3 seconds I get between the last episode and the next one, right? Being more courageous people, right? And being more loving, having more faith, right? Having more hope. All of these things are gifts that God wants to give us to make us grow, to be able to bring the world that God wants into existence. This is a transition in our own being. We start in one place, and as we grow into the virtuous life, we transition or change into another. Now, I don't think that's particularly problematic because that's how many of us learn about the Christian life. But I wonder if we have a limited imagination about how much God calls us out of and into, right? I think we tend to think that when God calls us, God is only calling us to sometimes the life of the mind, or maybe we just have to give up something that we really, really like. Like we all just got over Lent, so many of us have now returned to unlimited chocolate, and maybe now we have given up on all those other wonderful things. I don't know what we're up to, right? But we imagine that the virtuous life is like that, giving up things I don't like, or becoming or having these things take place in my spiritual being. But we never extend it to our embodiment ourselves. We see that as like a line in the sand sometimes. But I think what trans and gender non-binary people offer is this, or not offer in the sense of that this is what their lives amount to, but offer us in terms of a larger perspective, is that God can call all of us, every single aspect of who we are, mind, and body into a new possibility. When you ask trans people about their journey, especially trans Christians, and one who's particularly famous here is a person named Justin Saviatanis, who's a theologian out in Minnesota. He writes about his transition as fundamentally a calling, which means he writes about it, if I can translate a bit, like Matthew. One day, he was living his life, and then Jesus comes in and shakes him out and says, "Follow me." And part of what that following means for Professor Justice Saviatanis, is not just talking about adopting the virtues and loving God more deeply, but he experienced God calling him into a fullness of this masculine identity. And he was willing to take all the risks associated with that. And we know there are risks. It is not easy to be trans in our current society. And yet, like Matthew, he got up. And maybe if you talk to him, maybe he would say it wasn't like that. And maybe there was like sleepless nights, and maybe there was a lot of crying, I imagine, maybe a lot of anxiety, but he followed the voice. I wonder if we thought more about discipleship as transitioning, it lays the groundwork for understanding the world view that is in front of the trans person who also is following God, right? And that their transition becomes paradigmatic of all the transitions that God asks us to make in our lives, that we are called to give everything to God and to follow what that call looks like. So that second observation, ancient observation of the church, is that we have to follow God. And God wants us to change into who God wants us to be. And calling is that way that we think about it. The last thing I want to highlight is from the book of Job. Now, this one's a little longer of a read, but not too long. I'll set the scene a little bit. For those of you who haven't read Job in a while, it's one of my favorite books, mostly because God gives these speeches that are equivalent of like divine smackdowns. Like as soon as you read this text, you're like, oh, God is going to be like godlike, and however you imagine God, irenic, maybe sitting on a throne, maybe giving out some like, I don't know, goodies to people, or maybe you imagine God as kind of like, yeah, I'm a little busy today, but I want to talk to you, Job, right? God in the book of Job is as serious as a heart attack. God in the book of Job emerges at the end of a story where Job, who is described as the most righteous person living on earth, has fallen into this grave disease state. All of his family has died, all of his property has been taken away, and he is living with something like leprosy, right? He is decaying. His body is withering away, and he has been asking God, why is this happening to me? And Job has people in his life who come on the scene called his friends. His friends say to him, Job, the reason why you're in this state is because you clearly have messed up somewhere, right? And Job is like, you are the least helpful friends I could ever possibly imagine at this point. Job knows he's innocent, and yet his friends show up and say, we know why everything is working out. God is punishing you for X, Y, and Z, and that's the only reason why this could ever happen to you, because we have the understanding. We know, right? These are the theologians. When I teach this class, I say they're like the theologians. They come in and like, this is the answer. This is the reason. This is why it's happening, and this is what God is doing, right? And when God finally shows up, God confronts Job with poetry. God confronts Job with a series of questions and interrogations that are overwhelming. I'm going to read them, and then I'll come back to the commentary. So this is God speaking. Have you, Job, commanded the morning since your days began and caused the dawn to know its place? Director's cut. No. Have you caused the dawn to know its place so that it might take hold of the skirts of the earth and the wicked be shaken out of it? Job was like, no. Then God says, have you comprehended the expanse of the earth? Declare if you know all this. Of course, Job is going to say, no. Then God continues, is it by your wisdom, Job, that the hawk soars and spreads its wings toward the south? No. Is it by your command that the eagle mounts up and makes its nest on high? No. And the Lord said to Job, shall a fault finder contend with the Almighty? Anyone who argues must respond. And as we learn, Job actually says later, I have nothing to say. Job is being overwhelmed, I want to offer, with God saying, look at everything that I have done and how incomprehensible it is. From every atom that exists, every proton, and I stopped taking physics, so I have no idea where we're at on the low level. A quark maybe was probably, I think, as small as I got before I sort of checked out and ran to the humanities, right? As small as quarks to something as large as Jupiter and Saturn. You've all of this, and there are billions of galaxies, all of this. I have designed all of this. How can your friend show up and be able to just tell you what the truth is, why this stuff is happening to you? God is saying, I exist way beyond what we think. My wisdom is so vast that you can't figure it out. Remember that, I think God is trying to offer Job. Remember that God exists beyond our best ideas, beyond the best books that theologians will write, beyond the best sermons you'll hear, beyond all of this. God is beyond all of that. And God is so far beyond, God never gives Job a straight answer. The only thing God gives Job is images, because that's all that our little minds can handle, right? The difference between God and Job's friends, or the people who are saying, hey, we understand what's going on in you, Job. This is what God is doing. This is why God is doing it, right? Right. Is that God exists beyond all these paradigms, but we, sometimes acting like theologians, like me, try to put God in a paradigm, put God in a system. And what God constantly does is blow up that system. God says, I'm beyond that system. And how does God point towards that? God says, look at all this mystery. All those questions invite us in like mystery, invite us deeper into trying to comprehend this mystery, right? God says the best example I can give you for try to get you to understand who I am is to point you towards the mystery in the world that you experience every day. And so God is this mystery, this incomprehensible mystery that goes beyond our paradigms, beyond what we can conceive. And that is what makes God queer to us, fundamentally unlike us, fundamentally strange, right? And I think we would do well not to imitate the pitfall of Job's friends by trying to lock God into paradigms that we already know don't reflect the density and the complexity of the world that God created. So this brings us back to Genesis. If we think that God exists only in a binary male-female system, God blows that up just by pointing us more to creation, right? If we think that no one could want to transition from gender, God has blown that up by showing us these people who exist beyond these simple categories. And that points not towards what you might say as a cheapening of creation, but towards a deeper appreciation of it. That if God is beyond gender, beyond sex, wouldn't the vastness of God created in the world also show these beings that are also beyond these categorizations, right? So I want to conclude just with two things, right? I'm an ethicist. So at the end of the day, we can talk all this theology, but what do we do about it? Because, I don't know any other way of thinking. I think this leads us to two observations, and I hope we can start a conversation with this, right? First, we need to be suspicious of any efforts, theological or otherwise, that remove or attempt to resolve the mysteriousness surrounding our embodiment, right? That when we read in the Bible that we are made in the image of God, I think the way we should read that is that we are made in the image of a mystery. And when we try to collapse that mystery, we end up doing violence towards that fundamental observation that comes from the ancient church. But second, more positively, we also have an ethical obligation to preserve as much of this embodied diversity as possible, precisely because this diversity testifies to the magnitude of the mystery. And we can go back to Genesis for this, right? Many people only read Genesis 1:27 and say that God created human beings in God's image, male and female, and that's all you get. But the verse before it says that human beings are related to all this other diversity. We are related to the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, the cattle that go all over the world, and all the creeping things that I prefer not to think about, right? All those things we're related to, and we have care for, that we're supposed to preserve. we have an obligation, just as we want to preserve the diversity of our created world beyond human beings, we also need to preserve that for ourselves in our own human species. And so that means for us that we should allow these queer bodies that exist in the world to deepen our understanding of the queer God to which we are already oriented. Bodies that seem strange or different, or experiences that seem strange or different, should not make us shrink or make us fear, but should actually allow us to ask, oh, how does this person highlight and continue to help us point towards the mystery that sits at the basis of our entire existence? Because those strange bodies, those queer bodies, all of those bodies and our own all point back to that observation that we began, that all of us are made in the image of this queer, mysterious, and incomprehensible God. Thank you.
And I'm going to say thank you. Can you hear me there, Professor Ford?
Yes, I can.
So we're going to go forward, and I am going to invite Ellen Connick, the executive director of Commonweal magazine, who has been accompanying this series, to offer a few reflections on what you have said. And then we have some questions from our audience, and I will have a few questions for you too. Okay, Ellen, if you would pick it up.
Happily. Thank you, Professor Ford, so much. And thank you again, Professor Della Valle, for the chance to participate in these webinars, which I think are so exciting. So my name is Ellen Connick. I have maybe seen some of you here before at the first session. I'm the executive director of Commonweal, which is a lay Catholic journal of opinion that is now in its 100th year this year of continuous publication. I am an executive director, and therefore I am not a theologian. Let alone a theologian with a specialty in queer theology. So I want to offer remarks not from a place of expertise, but as a fellow fascinated learner. I am fascinated by Professor Ford's observations about the mysteriousness of God and the way he roots this mystery in Scripture, demonstrating our call to follow that mystery through the practice of discipleship and the demand that we ultimately stand in awe of mystery. In particular, I'm intrigued by Dr. Ford's rereading of the Genesis 1:26 and 27 text, which is so often used to insist on a gender binary, rather than used, as in his case, as a chance to expand what the image of God might be. This reading that he offers has never occurred to me, and perhaps not to you either, fellow fascinated learners and listeners. But of course, as soon as he noted it, it seemed so obvious. Let me give you an example of why it's so obvious. I have 2 children, 2 boys, in fact. And if someone had said, Ellen has 2 kids in her image, a Johnny and a Wally, those are my kids' names, Johnny and Wally, would the fact of my saying there is a Johnny in my image and there's a Wally in my image preclude the possibility of other versions of my image passed down in children? Of course, it wouldn't. No, certainly not. There could be Paulies, there could be Annies, there could be Eddies, there could be Charlie, there could be, who knows? There could be many, many iterations, and not one of them will be a Johnny or a Wally. Those will be singular. In fact, I'm an identical twin, and even that is not, there's no duplication of exactly who we are. So the idea that, I love the idea that naming 2 possibilities need not limit all possibilities. It's so obvious when it comes to me in my limited creative capacity that naturally I think how much more obvious and more true it must be of God, who is infinitely creative and whose image is infinitely more complex, more nuanced, more capacious, and far deeper than my own in terms of all the possible iterations. So just this idea that a reading would open up a vast possibility just by reframing what we think of as 2 possibilities rather than all possibilities, which is nowhere in the text. It doesn't say, and that's it, and those are all the possibilities. So thank you for that insightful and now totally obvious rereading of a text that I think for has so long served an alternate purpose. My second brief observation is about Professor Ford's insights around the incomprehensibility of God, this utter mystery of God. I have encountered this reality, this truth that he is describing theologically and ethically through, not through queer theology first, but through suffering and through a theology that attempts to make sense of suffering. I won't sidetrack us from the conversation at hand here where we want to talk about gender and Catholicism. But I will say that it was the wrestling with the death of my brother that ultimately permitted me to realize that God does not fit, as Professor Ford has said, into a neat box. For me, this meant understanding God through God's absence, something that before grief required me to articulate this, I would have thought utterly impossible. Of course, that's because it is impossible through the lens of logic alone. But through the lens of an apophatic theology, it's perfectly possible to understand God's absence as one of God's many attributes, just like God's presence. And why shouldn't this be possible for God, who defies the categories we use to contain and understand and name God? I think it was St. Anselm, but tell me if I'm wrong here, Professor Ford, who said that, to paraphrase, and probably badly, whoever you think of when you think of God, that's not God, who could certainly never fit in the space of your imagination. So whatever you think of when you think of God, you have already failed to think of God. That you've already lost the game. This same instinct applies, I think, to queer theology. To understand God as precisely what we would never expect God to be may be the starting point for a contemplative, radical love of God as mystery. It may very well be an invitation to a spirituality that demands we release our grip on a God who looks and sounds and smells and acts suspiciously like we look and sound and smell and act. To use Professor Ford's words, this is a form of idolatry, and it is a serious temptation, of course. I want to end my observations and my reflections with a few questions for Professor Ford, because I am, as I said, a fellow fascinated learner and by no means an expert. So as I was listening and with the chance to read a few ahead a little bit in advance of our discussion today, I'm curious, how would you define queerness and how might you define mysteriousness? And then how are those definitions for you related to each other?
Thank you, Owen. Thank you for that beautiful response. I appreciate that. So your question about how to relate queerness and mysteriousness. I think one link between the two is from a point of view of someone trying to observing something. If you observe something that seems strange, out of place, that seems to be outside of what you're used to, you may be inclined, maybe if you're more poetic, but maybe you might be inclined to just say, that's mysterious. That's, this person's a mystery, this is a mystery or something that you can't wrap your mind around. And I think that is something that connects us to God, right? That, as I said before, that God is this person that is fundamentally a mystery because God is the only being, so to speak, that need exist. All of our existence is a gift. That's what makes us, all of us are contingent, is another word you could say. All of us exist because God loves us into existence, right? And that's the big difference, that at every moment, God is sustaining everything. But God doesn't have to do any of this stuff. And that is strange to think about. And I think of often we use the term queer and the way it can be seen, if you look at the dictionary, one of its definitions might be strange, right? And I think that connection has been used in ways to denigrate queer people, right? Sometimes queer could have been used in the past as something that's seen as undesirable because you're not fitting in, or maybe in some ways it could be used even as a slur in some cases, like he's a queer, things like that. And there's this reclamation of queerness as this reflection of this vast being. So when we think about something that's queer, it sits outside of our categories. And so that is the first reaction. And then that's our first kind of impression. And then our reaction then is our moral response to that, right? We can look at the reality of God and push it away. And we can look at our fellow human being and push them away. But my suggestion is that we should do the opposite, that insofar as Christians believe that God is a mystery and that God is drawing us deeper into that mystery, then as we see other people and recognize them as mysteries, right? And this doesn't have to be about gender. This could be about, like, my grandpa was married to my grandma for like 50 something years. And then before he died, he kept saying, I learn more about this person every day. I don't think I've got 55 years of content to learn about from someone marries me, I think we're going to get it in maybe 25, after that, you know me. But there's that mysterious depth. And that makes someone queer to us, right? But what attitude do we have around it? What attitude do we take towards it? Is it an embrace? Is it a curiosity? Is it an openness to that story and to learn, right? I think that's the difference. And that's one quick way to kind of think about queerness and mystery.
I love that, sitting outside our categories and then our moral reaction to that encounter. That's really elegant and gives me a lot to think about. I think Nancy also said she has questions, so I'm going to let her run unless she's offline, in which case I'll keep going.
No, I am,
Okay.
I am right here and I'm loving the conversation. And so, Professor Ford, if you don't mind, I've kind of scanned through the questions. And so this is the lightning round. Are you ready? Okay, the
I'm
first one
ready.
actually, okay, good. The first one actually is my own question. I'm hearing a lot of the thought of Karl Rahner, who talked about God as mystery, in your appropriation of the word queer, which is really just pretty amazing as a destabilizing force for getting deeply into what Rahner might have meant. Does that have any resonance for you?
Absolutely. I think it resonates with all the Carls of that period, right? Even if you go down the hallway to Karl Barth, right? That's one of his fundamental
Absolutely.
theses, right? God is different, so different. How dare you think you understand, right?
Right. So
Yeah,
that Karl is interesting. I wanted to ask that too. Karl Rahner is saying God is absolute mystery, but he's still kind of doing this sort of, when God steps outside God's self, it's the human being who walks out there. So he wants this ontological connection. And Karl Barth, in a way that you are also talking about, says, nope, totally other, blows your mind. And so back to sort of what Ellen was saying, if you think you got a handle on this, you don't.
yeah. And one way to think about Barth is saying that God is so incomprehensible, the only testimony you get to any connection to God is Jesus. And so to a
Right.
certain extent, there's even more, I mean, I know there's a way in which their systems are different, but the way both affirm Jesus as this epistemic link to
Mhm.
knowledge of God, I think is an interesting parallel.
Okay, so then I'm going to have a question about that in a minute, but just first I'm going to get to a few other questions from our friends. This is short. The theologian who you mentioned from Minnesota, could you spell that person's last name? Tanis, did you say?
Yeah. Tanis, Tanis. And he wrote a book called,
Tanis.
T is in Tom, A, N is in Nancy, I, S is in Sam. Tanis.
And wrote a book called what?
Transgendered is the book title. It's a little bit dated. That's not a term we tend to use with the ed at the end, but it's transgendered, and then the subtitle is like community. There's like a few words there, but it's
Yeah,
transgendered is the title of the book.
that's fine. That would be enough for someone to search. And I would also add, several of you have asked if this is being recorded. And yes, you've mentioned your friend you'd like to show it to, can find us 1 or 2 weeks after this date. It will appear on our website. I have another question from the group here. Someone mentioned that you seem to consistently refer to God as he. Is that shorthand? How does that function?
So I use the word he just when I was quoting Genesis because that's how it is in the Bible. But my preference is to talk about God as God's own pronoun. So as the way you, Nancy, are saying, like God, God's self. So I was trying to lean into I like to lean into that gender neutral language as a scholar. But when I'm quoting, I try just to kind of quote what's in the, what's in it, what's in the text itself, just so that people can see the difference, but also appreciate similarities that God is beyond gender, but God can inhabit these identities, right? These images of God in a way that, people like Elizabeth Johnson and other people have said, right? That all these images of God tell us something right about God. They just don't tell us everything about God that we should know.
Exactly. Okay, that's very helpful. When I talk about inclusive language with my students, I often say the goal isn't to use she a lot about God. It's to stop thinking about gender and God and use God, even if it's kind of awkward. Then ask why it's awkward. So that's helpful. So another one. People have been reading the news as we all have, and it seems that there's going to be another document out on April 8th. Do you want to look into your magic ball and make any predictions about a document that's going to come? Actually, I believe from what's now called the Dicastery for the Doctrine of Faith, the DDF, it used to be the CDF, on gender, with this new secretary for the CDF, who is kind of closer theologically to Pope Francis. Any sense of that, or what would be your questions or concerns?
Yeah, crystal ball. Ew. Well, what we've seen, in my opinion, come from the Vatican when it talks about gender has been somewhat polemical, I think, at times. That, when gender gets referenced, it's either referenced in the way that we get that resonates with like the theology of the body that comes out of John Paul II, or we get this reference to this polemical concept known as gender ideology. And gender ideology is tough to nail down as a concept because it actually is an oppositional concept. Gender ideology covers any sort of of conceptual framework or conviction that in some way would disagree with the account around gender that's offered by the official magisterium, right, and the official teaching, the imagination of the church.
Mary?
I worry that the ways that the Vatican may speak about gender may not reflect the conversation and the complexity of the conversation that might be happening in other realms, even among other Christians. And that is my only worry. One of my worries is that if the document insists that all of the stuff that we're learning is irrelevant but doesn't engage it, I think it will lead other people to kind of just saying, I think, as you said in your introduction, Nancy, the Vatican may not care about this conversation, right? And that is what worries me because I think with every official document, if people read it and say, I can't see myself here, this is not going to work, people are going to walk. And so I'm less worried about like the doctrine. The doctrine, the doctrine's they're going to say what they're going to say. I'm worried about whether or not people will perceive it as our continued discernment as a church of what the truth is, right? And that's the worry that I have, right? Is that if conversations get dismissed, well, people say, well, why is it being dismissed, right? And some might say, well, it's being dismissed because it's irrelevant. I think that's dangerous. Other people might say it's being dismissed because there's something that they're afraid of, right? And I think that like we won't know unless we really get that dense conversation.
Good. Yeah, no, I agree. And that the idea that somehow a conversation is ready to be shut down doesn't seem like the right thing right at this moment. A couple of just short questions that are questions you've probably heard before, okay? One is people feel that there is a lot of talk in the culture about transgender persons and LGBT persons, and it seems like it's a new phenomenon. And so how would you respond to that?
Well, I think that the terms we use are more recent, but the reality has like the reality of people who don't fit our binary notion of gender. We have tons of documentation about that, and even in the Bible, we have people whose identities in some way mess with gender or mess with our typical categories that we would have around gender. And so I think, and when we look at if we just go into anthropology more broadly, even beyond the biblical text, we know that there are people who have been hailed as two-spirited, right? This is a concept we get from our native siblings, native here in North America. The reality that we call transgender, gender non-binary people today existed prior to the term, but the terminology that we're using now, that is certainly newer. But there's tons of testimony around the world of people who exist beyond the gender binary.
Yeah. One other question that, again, that probably you've heard before. The Roman Catholic tradition is more recently especially under Francis, has adopted a more pastoral tone, seeking to say that we are inclusive of all persons, but still going to an act-centered morality. As an ethicist, you certainly have this is familiar ground to you. What do you say about that distinction?
Yeah, I think so. I hear on the one hand, right, the attitude that we like to project, right? All are welcome, right? The Marty Haugen song, maybe you're hearing it in your mind right now as I mention it, right?
Thank you for that.
Yeah, maybe you're hearing this song about all are welcome, right, in this place. And then you have this like interesting moral theological question, like act-centered morality versus the other term is like person-centered morality. I think it might be helpful to break those two apart. I find that often when church leaders say that we are welcoming to everyone, they actually don't mean that. What they actually mean is everyone's invited, right? When you invite someone, like when you invited me, Professor Dalla to give this talk, I could accept it. And the terms of the acceptance was, are you going to do this or are you not? And if I said no, then that's the end of it, right? But if I say yes, right, if I accept the invitation, I am living up to the expectation that you're setting around what that interaction will look like, right? But welcome, on the other hand, is something where you as the issuer lose control. In order for someone to say that they are welcome, they have to report that. So when you say that I welcome you, it's really a question. Like, do you feel welcomed in my house? Do you feel welcome in my classroom? Do you feel welcome in these places? And if someone says yes, then that welcoming atmosphere is present, right? I think often in churches, we say people are welcome, but we're really just inviting people in and saying, well, here are the terms and conditions of what it means to do X, Y, or Z, right? That's an invitation, right? Whereas welcome depends on the person who's received it, right? And everyone knows that what church is about. Church is about people who are on this journey. And like I said, it involves discipleship, it involves transition in that paradigm I'm trying to offer. It involves all this stuff. So you have to know something's got to change, right? We got all these sacraments about how you're going to change, right? Confession, what are you sorry for? Eucharist, what are you turning into? They're constant reminders that we have to change and grow. Everyone knows this, whether you're cisgender, transgender, gay, bi, all of us know that when we step in church, it's not like sitting in a spa. We're being challenged to change. But some people are being asked to change in ways that seem to bear the brunt of what it means to be fundamentally, a good Christian versus fundamentally a really bad Christian. And I think we use gender and sexuality as a way to dole this out. And so many LGBTQ Christians feel that they are second-class citizens or, first-class sinners, depending on how you want to, what analogy you want to use
Oh my gosh.
in the church.
Oh my gosh.
And so, it's like their lives are on blast in ways that no one else's lives are, right? Like, you might hear a homily that is about, the threat to the family posed by same-sex marriage, so to speak. But I don't hear a lot of homilies about contraception, right? So or how problematic that is, right? And so like these people's lives seem to get focused on, and if they don't accept a cis identity, if they don't accept living in a celibate lifestyle, if they are in a same-sex relationship or gay or lesbian, right? They're almost seen as you can't be in the church. And there are bishops releasing documents that say that, right?
Right.
So
right.
that's not what we're reading, Whereas other people who are bringing their lives in all of this richness, but also in all of our vulnerability and frailty, they don't have their lives called out like that. Like their lives, like they're not called out in that way. And so I think those people can feel welcome because they know that even though a church is a community of transformation, they feel like they are growing and not being singled out. But for our LGBTQ plus siblings, I think many of them feel like they are being singled out and that their lives are exemplary for problematic behavior. And that is the problem, right? And so to bring to the second term, is so act-centered on what they're doing that you miss the reality of the person, right? I think with LGBTQ plus people, we have to return to honoring the person and their complexity in the way that we do for other people when we welcome them. And then I think otherwise we're just issuing invitations.
Professor Ford, what you just said is so important and really sums up so well what you said. We are going to leave it there. I'm going to say thank you so much from Fairfield University and from Commonweal Magazine. This has been a wonderful end to this. And so I really hope that we get to hear from you again in the future. Fairfield University and Commonweal will be taking up this series again next spring with another 3-session Zoom series on exactly again, Catholicism and gender. Thank you so much, Ellen Connick. Thank you so much, Craig Ford. And to everyone, good night.